Due to the graphic nature of this murder case, listener discretion is advised. This episode includes discussions of murder and assault. We advise extreme caution for children under 13.
Beginning in the mid-20th century, an urban legend circulated through the United States.
A teenage babysitter sat downstairs. The children she was watching were upstairs, fast asleep. Suddenly, the phone rang.
I'm upstairs with the children.
The babysitter hung up, hoping the creepy call was just a prank. But then the phone rang again.
I'm upstairs with the children. You'd better come up.
Terrified, the babysitter called the telephone operator and asked them to trace the call. A few moments passed, and the operator told the babysitter to run. The call was coming from inside the house.
The babysitter sprinted out the front door. Just before she slammed it shut, she caught sight of a man lumbering down the stairs. A butcher's knife, stained red, glinted in his hand. She'd barely escaped the killer.
But the children upstairs hadn't been as lucky.
Spotify.
This is our first episode in a special 3-part series on babysitters. For the next 3 weeks, we're diving into the history of babysitting in American culture. We'll explore how babysitters became the subjects of urban legends, slasher films, and real-life crimes.
This week, we're discussing the beginnings of babysitting and the cultural backlash centered on teenage girls. We'll also cover the 1950 murder of Janett Christman. Some say the 13-year-old babysitter was killed by a family friend. Her tragic story is often cited as the inspiration for the bone-chilling legend, The Babysitter and the Man Upstairs.
Next week, we'll cover the evolution of the American babysitter and the disappearance of 15-year-old Evelyn Hartley. The urban legend of the babysitter and the man upstairs is believed to have originated in the mid-1900s. But this creepy tale didn't come out of nowhere. It was inspired by 20th century American culture, and maybe even one real-life crime.
In the late 1940s, America was rapidly changing. World War II had recently come to an end. Men returned home from the battlefield to find their country and their homes much different from when they left.
This was mostly because when hundreds of thousands of men were deployed, women filled their places in the workforce. Women finally had the opportunity to build their own careers and earn their own money. This led to a large-scale shift in American gender roles. It also had another more unexpected side effect.
Women's entry into the workforce led to a babysitting boom. Parenting was still markedly inequitable, so even when married mothers worked full-time, their husbands rarely helped with household chores and childcare. Instead, they hired babysitters and nannies to pick up the slack.
And these babysitters were often, of course, teenage girls. More than ever, childcare responsibilities were being handed down to children. With this came some cultural anxiety about whether or not adolescent girls could be trusted as childcare providers.
The legend of the babysitter and the man upstairs may reflect this anxiety. On its surface, it's a story about a crazed killer, but beneath that, it could be a tale about how equipped teenage girls are to care for other people's kids. The legend's underlying message could be interpreted as babysitters being inadequate caretakers. It supports the fearful notion that while parents will sacrifice themselves to save their child, babysitters will always protect themselves first.
And so, a seed of doubt was planted. Teenage girls were turned into the scapegoat for a deluge of societal issues, including the perceived breakdown of traditional gender roles and the nuclear family.
But in reality, These girls weren't nearly as conniving and untrustworthy as they were made out to be. More often than not, they were the victims. They were routinely underpaid and mistreated while on the job.
And of course, some babysitters became the victims of terrifying crimes, one of which might have helped inspire that creepy urban legend.
In March of 1950, in Columbia, Missouri, a 13-year-old girl named Janett Christman was working to pay off a new Easter suit. The outfit was gorgeous. The material was soft, the color deep maroon. But it came at a steep price.
Mom!
Yes, Janet?
Mr. Romack needs someone to babysit tonight.
I thought you wanted to go to the school dance.
I did, but if I babysit, I'll finally have enough money to pay off my suit.
That's true, but are you sure? Isn't their little boy a bit of a handful?
Mr. Romack said Greg's calmed down since he turned 3. He'll probably just sleep while I'm there. Plus, the Romacks have a piano, so I can practice.
Well, all right. Is Mr. Romack coming to pick you up?
Yep, he'll be here at 7.
At 7 p.m. on March 18th, 1950, Edward Romack arrived to pick Janett up. Mr. Romack was a middle-aged man with a good reputation. Janett's mother didn't think anything of allowing her daughter to hop in the car with him.
But for Janett, the weather made the drive a little unsettling. Snow was common in Missouri, even in the spring. That night, the temperature hovered in the mid-20s Fahrenheit. Heavy wind blew rain and sleet across the windshield.
By the time they arrived at the Romacks' home around 7:30, Janett was glad to get out of the car. The Romacks' large 6-bedroom house was just west of the city limits. The area was more rural than Janett was used to, but Mr. Romack assured her she'd be perfectly safe.
And on the off chance that an animal or another attacker came to the house, Mr. Romack wouldn't leave Janett unarmed. He taught the 13-year-old girl how to use his shotgun.
If you hear any rustling, don't be afraid to let a shot off. Better safe than sorry.
Okay.
Keep the door locked. Don't open it for anyone you don't know.
Yes, sir.
And when you hear me and Mrs. Romack come home tonight, flip on the porch light, all right?
Will do.
Perfect. Greg's already sleeping. Just leave his little radio on, and he'll snore the whole time we're gone.
At around 8 o'clock, Mr. and Mrs. Romack left to go play bridge with some friends. Janett locked the door behind them.
She presumably checked on 3-year-old Greg, who was fast asleep upstairs. Then she sat before the Romacks piano. It was nicer than anything her parents could afford. The seat was plush, the keys pristine. She took out some sheet music
and played.
It's impossible to know exactly what happened inside the Romacks' house that evening, but it's likely that Janett continued playing the piano for a while. She might have stepped away to study or daydreamed about her new Easter suit.
Then, around 10:30 p.m., she heard footsteps on the porch outside.
Janett wondered if perhaps the Romacks had come home early. She turned on the front porch light.
We'll never know for sure who Janett saw standing outside. All that's certain is that 5 minutes later at 10:35 p.m., Officer Roy McCowan of the Columbia Police Department received a terrifying call.
Through the phone, McCowan heard a young girl, presumably Janett, screaming. She begged the police to come quick.
But before the girl could identify herself or give Officer McCowan her location, the call cut off. Unfortunately, the department was woefully understaffed that evening, and there was no one to actually trace the call. Police couldn't figure out where the girl was, so they couldn't do anything to help her.
A full 3 hours later, at about 1:30 a.m., Mr. and Mrs. Romack pulled up outside their home.
That's odd. The porch light's already on.
Maybe Janett saw us drive up the road.
Maybe. Honey?
Uh-huh.
One of the windows is broken.
What?
And the front door's unlocked.
Mr. and Mrs. Romack stepped inside, their stomachs in knots. They crossed into the sitting room and entered a living nightmare.
Coming up, the Romacks' peaceful home turns into a crime scene.
On March 18, 1950, 13-year-old Janett Christman babysat for Mr. and Mrs. Edward Romack. The Romacks left their home just outside of Columbia, Missouri, to go play bridge. When they returned home at around 1:30 a.m., they found the porch light on, a window broken, and the front door unlocked.
They went into the living room and found themselves face to face with a scene they'd never forget.
Janett lay dead beside the piano. Her body was splayed out on the carpet, surrounded by a pool of blood. She'd been sexually assaulted. Her face was covered in scratches and small, circular puncture wounds. The cord of a clothing iron was wrapped around her neck.
Oh my god, how did this...
I don't...
Edward, where's Greg?
He was sleeping upstairs when we left.
Mrs. Romack had tunnel vision. All she could think of was her 3-year-old son.
And thankfully, she found him upstairs, sound asleep, exactly as they'd left him. While she hugged her child, her husband called the police.
I hired a babysitter, Janett Christman. Something terrible happened.
What happened, sir?
I don't know.
Around 2 o'clock in the morning, officers from the Boone County Sheriff's Department arrived at the Romacks' home. They found evidence that Mr. and Mrs. Romack missed.
Firstly, signs of a struggle stretched from the kitchen, where the Romacks' phone was, into the living room. It not only showed that the teenager fought her attacker tooth and nail, but it also lent credence to the theory that the phone call Officer Roy McGowan received was in fact from Janett.
Secondly, deputies determined that the puncture marks on Janett's face must have been made by some kind of a small, round instrument, possibly something metal. But these wounds didn't kill her. It was the cord which her attacker had used to asphyxiate her that ultimately led to her death. And that cord had been torn off an iron found inside the Romacks' home.
Whoever did this knew where to find the iron. It was in a linen closet, and the killer took it out.
What are you saying?
I'm not saying anything. I just think that whoever killed Janett knew their way around Mr. or Mrs. Romack's home. Strikes me as a little funny.
I don't think there's anything funny about this.
Strikes me as a little odd.
But that wasn't the most distressing piece of information. Upon closer examination, the deputies realized that Janett's killer couldn't have entered through the broken window. A side table and some other furniture sat right beneath it, but nothing had been disturbed.
In other words, the shattered window was a distraction. Whoever attacked Janett wanted police to think they'd broken in.
Why would someone stage a break-in?
Think about it. The killer knows their way around the house.
Or so you think.
So they probably know Janett too.
I still don't get it.
The killer doesn't want to get caught, obviously. They stage a break-in to hide how they actually entered. But why would they want to hide how they actually entered? Because their means of entry would reveal something about who they are.
Okay.
And what was the killer's means of entry? Simple. The front door. When Mr. and Mrs. Romack came home, it was unlocked. That means one of two things. Either the killer had a key, or Janett let them inside. Who would Janett let inside? Only someone she knew and trusted.
So Janett knew her killer, and her killer knew the Romacks' home. That means...
It doesn't mean anything yet. But it's pretty funny, isn't it?
Yeah, pretty funny.
Between themselves, the deputies already had a theory. They thought the crime was an inside job. They didn't say it out loud, but they had their suspicions centered on Edward Romack.
However, the Boone County Sheriff, Glenn Powell, wasn't so quick to draw such a conclusion. He ordered deputies to take fingerprint samples from the scene and had Janett's body sent to a medical examiner. He also swabbed beneath Janett's fingernails and sent the samples to be tested. He hoped that in her fight with her killer, Janett had managed to scrape off some skin or blood that would lead to the murderer's arrest.
Finally, Sheriff Powell called in a couple of bloodhounds, hoping the dogs might pick up on any strange smells in the Romacks' home.
If the bloodhounds were to be trusted, they suggested two things. Firstly, there was an unusual scent in the home, one that didn't come from Edward Romack. Secondly, Janett's killer probably fled the house and escaped through the brush.
Between the struggle inside the home and the run through the woods, the murderer had probably sustained some cuts and bruises, if not more serious injuries.
But that was all authorities could figure out for the time being. It was likely nearing 3 o'clock in the morning, and they'd have to wait until the next day for results from the medical examiner or forensic scientists.
The next morning, Columbia Police Chief Eugene Pond delivered news of the horrifying crime to the public. According to one recollection, he asked locals to be on the lookout for anyone donning suspicious scratch marks or exhibiting uncharacteristically odd behavior.
But Sheriff Powell and his team were surprised to hear this announcement coming from the city's police chief. The crime had taken place just outside of Columbia's city limits, which meant it was under the jurisdiction of county officials. Technically, the police chief shouldn't have been so heavily involved in the investigation.
It put Sheriff Powell in an awkward position. He didn't want to have to argue with the city police, but technically this was his case. He worried that splitting the work between two separate organizations could cause problems.
And he was right. In the days after the crime, Police Chief Pond made a number of decisions that may have hindered the investigation. Among them, a city police officer was assigned to sit and watch the Romacks' home and wait for the killer to return. Even if Pond meant well, it seemed very, very unlikely that the murderer would go back to the scene of the crime. The officer wasted valuable hours sitting in the country house doing nothing.
Worse yet, Chief Pond required officers to work 12-hour shifts. Again, he probably thought he was doing the right thing. In his mind, more hours may have meant more investigation, but really, excessively long shifts meant police were overtired, unproductive, and prone to making mistakes.
Things got contentious quickly. While sheriff's deputies pored over the county's crime records, looking for the names of violent offenders, city police detained potential suspects.
And they didn't always treat them nicely. A local carpenter was arrested on suspicion of the crime, and he claimed his interrogation went something like this.
I'm gonna have to ask you to undress.
What?
We need to check your body for any scrapes or bruises.
No way.
Sounds like you got something to hide.
Sounds like I've got rights. I don't have to strip for you.
Where were you on the night of March 18th?
None of your business.
Answer me!
Screw you!
According to the carpenter, the officer beat him while he was in police custody. Chief Eugene Pond contested this claim. Reportedly, the carpenter was simply asked to undress, and no physical altercation ever took place.
Whatever really happened, the whole affair scandalized Sheriff Glenn Powell. The Columbia Police Department shouldn't have been arresting suspects at all, let alone interrogating them. Their involvement was a distraction at best, and the carpenter's accusation made the entire investigation seem illegitimate.
Nevertheless, the Columbia PD continued detaining suspects. They interviewed hundreds of people. One young man even confessed to the crime. It was later discovered that his statement had been falsified, and it's unclear why he admitted to the killing in the first place.
The city police department wasn't making any headway, but neither were the sheriff and his deputies. The analysis of the fingerprints found at the Romacks' home didn't reveal anything. The swab taken from underneath Janett's fingernails didn't lead anywhere either.
About a week had passed since Janett Christman's murder, and law enforcement wasn't any closer to finding answers.
Desperate, they put out a $1,000 reward, the equivalent of over $11,000 today, for information leading to the arrest and conviction of Janett's killer. It was a hefty sum, and they hoped it was enough to make somebody talk.
And as it turned out, someone was hiding something. But money wouldn't make them speak with police.
Their conscience would.
Coming up, Edward Romack spills his terrible secret. Now, back to the story.
On March 18, 1950, 13-year-old Janett Christman was murdered while babysitting for Mr. and Mrs. Edward Romack. The sheriff's department processed the crime scene, but the investigation got tangled when local police, who didn't have jurisdiction over the case, arrested suspects.
After a week, authorities hadn't made any headway in their investigations. So the Boone County Sheriff's Department offered a cash reward for information leading to the arrest and conviction of Janett's killer.
But ultimately, the biggest breakthrough wouldn't have anything to do with this money. Mr. and Mrs. Edward Romack finally opened up to the police, and all their evidence pointed to one person.
His name's Robert Mueller. I've known him for a while. We're friends, or we were friends. I don't know anymore. Just, he knew Janett. He'd said things about her before.
What kinds of things?
He commented on her body. Often. And he used to talk about going down near the high school and trying to pick up a younger girl. I never thought he was serious.
Maybe you should have paid a little more attention.
Yeah, I should have.
27-year-old Robert Mueller was a friend of the Romacks. Edward had known him since they were children. As adults, Mueller often played bridge with the couple. He'd been to their house on multiple occasions. He knew his way around the large 6-bedroom home, and he certainly knew where to find the clothing iron. According to Mrs. Romack, he'd used it more than once.
And that wasn't all Mrs. Romack had to add.
He was creepy. I always felt uncomfortable around him. He made passes at me before. I always turned him down, but I got the feeling that, well, he wasn't very good at taking no for an answer, if you know what I mean. I told Edward that there was something wrong with him, but they'd been friends for so long. Anyway, he knew Janett was at our house that night. He'd actually asked her to babysit for him, but she'd already agreed to watch Greg. I get the feeling that he was going to get what he wanted no matter what it took, you know?
Robert Mueller was the authorities' prime and only suspect. Everything added up. He had made creepy remarks about Janett. He knew she'd be at the Romacks' house on March 18th, and he knew where to find the iron. Perhaps most importantly, Janett knew him. If he knocked on the door, she probably would have unlocked it and let him inside. She wouldn't have even thought to grab Mr. Romack's shotgun.
Police had enough to interrogate Mueller, but they wanted to catch him at a very specific time. According to Mr. Romack, Mueller almost always carried around a mechanical pencil.
In any other context, this might have been just a strange quirk, but Janett had been found with small, circular puncture wounds all over her face. Deputies thought the injuries might have come from a round instrument, just like the tiny tube-like end of a mechanical pencil.
If they could catch Mueller with the makeshift weapon, they just might be able to make an arrest.
If the sheriff's department and the local police had been working together, Robert Mueller's capture might have gone smoothly. Unfortunately, that isn't what happened.
In May of 1950, Sheriff Glenn Powell reportedly took Robert Mueller, without a warrant, to a deputy's private residence for questioning. This was very unusual. Normally, a criminal interrogation, especially one pertaining to a murder, would take place at the police station, with the consent of the prosecuting attorney. But it was alleged that Powell didn't tell the attorney about Mueller's questioning.
Powell was essentially circumventing the regular arrest process. It's unclear exactly why, but it's possibly because the prosecuting attorney had ties to the Columbia Police Department. The sheriff was already frustrated with local law enforcement. In all likelihood, he was trying to take back control over the case.
But the sheriff didn't force Robert Mueller to the farmhouse. He came willingly, and he stayed up practically all night answering Powell's questions.
Do you have an alibi for the night of March 18th?
I already talked to Edward about this. I told him, I don't got an alibi, but I don't got any scratches either.
What do you mean?
Well, you guys said whoever did it would have some scratches. I don't got any, so I guess it couldn't have been me, huh?
It's been almost 2 months. They could have healed by now.
Didn't have any marks back in March either.
Can you prove that?
No. Can you prove me wrong?
No.
Robert Mueller couldn't establish his own innocence, but he knew police couldn't demonstrate his guilt. In his conversation with Sheriff Powell, he held all the power.
Plus, as far as the available evidence shows, the mechanical pencil was a bust. Police might have proven Janett's injuries were inflicted with such an instrument, but they couldn't prove it was wielded by Robert Mueller.
Sheriff Powell got desperate. He felt certain that he'd found his culprit, but his hunch wouldn't hold up in court. So the next morning, May 5th, Powell asked Mueller to take a polygraph test. Mueller was more than happy to oblige.
Powell asked Mueller a series of questions about the crime. Mueller insisted he was completely innocent.
And Mueller passed. The polygraph test showed that he was telling the truth.
This might seem like proof of Mueller's innocence, but it's not. Lie detector tests are prone to mistakes, false positives, and false negatives. They're generally not accepted as evidence in court because they don't really measure lies. They just measure stress. So if Robert Mueller was a cool, calm, and collected liar, he would have had no problem passing the polygraph.
Nevertheless, this felt like the final nail in the coffin for Sheriff Powell. He'd broken rules to interrogate and test Robert Mueller, and he had little to show for it. On May 24, 1950, he presented his evidence to a grand jury in the hopes they'd vote to indict Mueller.
But the grand jury wasn't convinced. The evidence for Mueller's guilt was incomplete. Plus, the Columbia Police Department was still investigating other leads.
Ultimately, the grand jury decided not to indict anyone. They issued a scathing rebuke of law enforcement's messy investigation.
In the opinion of the grand jurors, much of the effort expended has been wasted and dissipated because of the failure to correlate the information available. Petty jealousies between the Boone County Sheriff's Department and the Columbia Police Department resulted in an almost complete lack of cooperation between the law enforcement agencies.
The jury found there to be insufficient evidence to indict. With that, the investigation into 13-year-old Janett Christman's death was over. The case remained officially open, but no new discoveries were made.
And soon after, Robert Mueller actually unsuccessfully tried to sue the Boone County Sheriff and a couple people in the office, alleging they had held and questioned him illegally.
Really, this lawsuit served as an example of Robert Mueller's incredible arrogance. He'd gone with the sheriff willingly, perhaps because being interrogated at a farmhouse would draw less attention than going to the police station. As soon as he got pulled into the limelight, however, he flipped the script. He argued that officers never had probable cause to question him, even though the circumstantial evidence of his guilt was strong.
In the end, the court ruled against Mueller. Shortly afterward, he joined the Air Force and left Columbia, Missouri.
It could have been a coincidence, but it sure seemed like he was running from something.
In more recent years, those close to the Christmans and the Romacks have spoken out about the crime. People who went to school with Janett say her death continues to haunt them. It hangs like a shadow over the once peaceful town of Columbia.
And according to his nephew, Sheriff Glenn Powell remained convinced of Robert Mueller's guilt until the day that he died. He kept his eyes open for proof that could put Mueller behind bars.
But in 2013, new evidence came to light. Maybe Sheriff Powell had been wrong.
A journalist for the Columbia Tribune published an article that suggested an alternative suspect. Lois Vogt, a woman who lived in Columbia at the time of Janett's murder, had come face to face with someone she thought was the killer. Lois said she'd been babysitting when a sinister-looking man knocked on the door. She didn't let him in, but after Janett's death, she realized she might have been within feet of a murderer.
Later on, Lois claims she met the man in town. She even pointed him out to her husband, but no one listened to her. No one but the Columbia Tribune journalist.
With this new information, the writer conducted an investigation of their own in 2013, 63 years after Janett's death. The man in question remains unnamed, but according to the journalist, he lived within a half mile of the Romacks' home. It would have been easy for him to commit the murder, then escape through the underbrush and back to his own house.
The writer also said the man might have had a record of spousal abuse, which would suggest the possibility of more violent crimes.
But when the journalist went to the Columbia Police Department to search for fingerprints and arrest records, there was nothing there. Somehow, over the years, the data from Janett Christman's murder had been lost.
With that, any hope of solving Janett's murder seemingly vanished.
We'll never know for sure who knocked on the Romacks' door on March 18th, 1950. However, with all the available evidence, I believe that 27-year-old Robert Mueller murdered Janett Christman. He was known to be aggressive and to make women uncomfortable. He'd reportedly expressed a perverse sexual interest in Janett. She would have trusted him enough to let him inside, and he knew the house well enough to find the iron cord that ultimately ended her life.
I have to agree. It's certainly possible that Lois Vogt's story is true, but without more evidence or even the name of the suspect, it's hard to believe. Robert Mueller checks all the boxes.
With no clear solution, Janett's murder haunts not just Columbia, but everyone who hears her story. Some even say her death inspired the urban legend of the babysitter and the man upstairs.
However, it's unlikely that Janett's murder directly led to the creepy story. Her murder was far different than the crime depicted in the legend.
Even so, Janett's death fed into the growing cultural fear. While American society scapegoated babysitters and teenage girls more broadly for countless social issues, babysitters themselves grew increasingly unsettled. Their jobs weren't just underpaid, they were potentially dangerous.
Janett Christman wasn't the first babysitter to be killed on the job, and she wouldn't be the last. 3 years later, in 1953, a 15-year-old girl named Evelyn Hartley disappeared while babysitting, and she was never seen again. In the 1950s, America saw the rise of something that had never really existed before: teenage culture.
This was the time of poodle skirts, soda parlors, and Elvis Presley. The word teenager was just entering the lexicon, but these young adults had more freedom and power than ever before. Companies specifically marketed products to teenagers, which meant high schoolers were anxious to make money.
And for teenage girls, there seemed to be only one job option: babysitting. It was a great way to get some pocket change, but it didn't come without problems. More and more often, babysitters were the subjects of creepy stories, real crimes, and perhaps something even more sinister: sexualization.
Beginning in the 1950s, books and films turned babysitters into sexual objects. In one 1969 movie simply titled The Babysitter, a teenage girl pursued a sexual relationship with her employer. The film made it seem like adolescent girls actually seduced grown men.
I wanted to try you out, to see what it would be like.
The babysitter. Don't let her in your house unless you want real trouble.
But the movie was written and directed by adult men. Subsequently, babysitters were increasingly viewed as temptresses. They were seen as the problem, while men who sexualized them got off scot-free.
And sometimes the men who killed teenage girls got off without punishment, too. In Wisconsin in 1953, a 15-year-old babysitter went missing. Her abductor and likely murderer was never brought to justice.
When babysitting first became a common practice, it ignited anxieties among parents. They worried about whether or not teenage girls could be trusted to watch their children. The general consensus seemed to be that adolescents cared more about themselves than the kids they were hired to oversee.
But soon the archetype of the untrustworthy sitter shifted. In the 1950s, books and movies started presenting babysitters as objects of sexual desire. In some cases, relationships between adolescent girls and middle-aged men were portrayed as consensual.
Of course, this wasn't realistic. According to anecdotes and interviews from the time period, it wasn't uncommon for teenage girls to have to reject advances from adult male employers. Though widely normalized, this kind of sexualization was predatory and could be threatening to a girl's emotional and physical health.
But how girls felt really didn't matter. After all, they weren't the ones telling the stories. Men were. Vladimir Nabokov, a man in his 50s, published the infamous novel Lolita around this time. It featured a middle-aged male narrator who sexualized, manipulated, and repeatedly assaulted a 12-year-old girl. Lolita was a victim of sexual abuse, and yet her name became synonymous with the word temptress.
Something similar happened with babysitters. They were the objects of male fantasies, but instead of holding men responsible for sexualizing teenagers, girls got blamed. They were seen as immoral and promiscuous. Worst of all, some men took it upon themselves to punish what they perceived as teenage girls' character flaws.
And this is where slasher films come in. According to Miriam Foreman Brunel's book Babysitter, An American History, babysitters became the target of punishing discipline. Horrific figures came forward to tame the temptress. The faceless movie maniac in the many horror movies that included babysitters knew no bounds. His victims would get what they deserved.
But these monsters didn't just exist in films. They were real. And in 1953, one of them showed up in La Crosse, Wisconsin.
October 24th, 1953, was homecoming night at La Crosse State College. 40-year-old Viggo Rasmussen and his wife wanted to go to the big football game, but their usual babysitter was unavailable. They needed to find someone new to watch their 20-month-old daughter, Janice.
Rasmussen knew that one of his colleagues, Richard Hartley, had a 15-year-old daughter named Evelyn. He called the Hartley home to see if Evelyn would be willing to babysit.
Hello?
Hi, Evelyn. It's Mr. Rasmussen. I wanted to see if you were planning to go to the homecoming game tonight.
No. I've got a lot of studying to do. Why?
I was hoping you might come watch Janice for the evening.
Oh.
You'd still be able to study, of course. Janice's bedtime is 7:30.
Oh, okay. Sure. I'd be happy to.
Oh, fantastic. I'll pick you up around 6.
Evelyn told her parents she'd be babysitting for the Rasmussens that night. They didn't mind, but Evelyn's father had one request. He asked her to call him around 8:30 p.m. to check in.
Evelyn agreed, and at approximately 6 p.m., she hopped into Viggo Rasmussen's car.
The pair drove across town. The Rasmussens lived in a modest home with a basement and a garage. It was in the middle of an average neighborhood, not unlike Evelyn's own. She felt perfectly safe.
Mr. Rasmussen showed Evelyn around the house. Then he grabbed his keys and told Evelyn that he and his wife would be back after the game.
Evelyn looked at baby Janice. She couldn't deny the toddler was cute. The pair played peekaboo until Evelyn decided it was time to study. She put Janice to bed in the crib and then flipped open one of the textbooks she'd brought with her.
Janice babbled, not quite ready to fall asleep, but Evelyn barely noticed her. The 15-year-old was too deep in her schoolwork. 5 minutes passed, then 15, then 30.
But then, at about 7 p.m., a neighbor heard somebody scream.
Honey, did you hear that?
It's probably just some kids playing outside.
Around 8 p.m., another neighbor saw a light-colored car circling through the neighborhood.
Finally, at 8:30 p.m., Evelyn Hartley's father watched his telephone. He waited for his daughter to check in with him, but she never did. He called the Rasmussens home, and no one answered.
Mr. Hartley's heart sped up. It wasn't like Evelyn to forget to check in, and she definitely wouldn't ignore a phone call. She was smart, responsible. He couldn't help but feel like something was wrong.
So he didn't waste any time. He drove straight to the Rasmussens' house. There he found all the lights on. The doors were locked. Through the window he saw baby Janice was asleep in her crib, totally unharmed.
Although Janice looked peaceful, the rest of the house did not. The living room furniture was in disarray. Evelyn's textbooks were scattered on the floor. One of her shoes looked like it had been thrown across the room. Her glasses, which she always wore, lay broken on the carpet.
Frantic, Mr. Hartley called for his daughter.
Evelyn! Evelyn!
He ran from window to window, searching for her. He didn't see her anywhere.
He sprinted across the yard, hoping to find more clues as to where his daughter could be.
About 100 feet from the Rasmussens' home, Mr. Hartley spied a small garage.
On the outside of the garage, about 4 feet off the ground, there was a bloody handprint. It was small and thin, a petite girl's palm. Evelyn's palm.
Mr. Hartley couldn't do anything else except call the police.
Coming up, authorities investigate Evelyn Hartley's disappearance.
On October 24th, 1953, 15-year-old Evelyn Hartley babysat for Professor Viggo Rasmussen in La Crosse, Wisconsin. When Evelyn didn't check in with her father at 8:30 p.m., he drove to the Rasmussens' home. He found 20-month-old baby Janice unharmed, but Evelyn was nowhere to be found.
There were signs that something terrible had happened. The living room was a disaster. Evelyn's glasses had been broken, and there was a bloody handprint on the outside of the Rasmussens' garage. When La Crosse police arrived, they found even more disturbing evidence.
Hey, come down here.
What is it?
Basement window's been pried open. There's a stepladder just outside it, and there are footprints all the way into the living room. This is where they broke in.
Oh, God.
It's definitely a kidnapping.
You want to tell her dad that?
Somebody has to.
Mr. Hartley already knew something awful had happened to his daughter, but the police confirmed his worst fears. Evelyn was gone, and the more clues they found, the bleaker the situation seemed.
There wasn't just blood on the outside of the garage. There were 2 separate pools of it in the Rasmussens' yard, one of which measured over a foot in diameter. A quick test confirmed that the blood matched Evelyn's type. In all likelihood, it was hers.
And if that wasn't bad enough, police also found Evelyn's underwear lying in the grass just east of the Rasmussens' house.
To police, all the evidence formed a macabre picture.
The attacker broke in through the basement window. They must have snuck upstairs and surprised Evelyn. There's clear evidence of a struggle. They fought and Evelyn lost her shoes and glasses. The attacker dragged her outside. Something happened that resulted in Evelyn bleeding. Maybe a cut or a blow. Whatever it was, she was still conscious. She probably ran towards the garage, hoping to escape, but the attacker caught up with her. At that point, they might have struck her in the head or in some way caused her to lose consciousness. The presence of underwear makes sexual assault seem likely. The pools of blood were probably left behind when the attacker sat her down, which happened twice. As for where they went, well, I'm not quite sure.
Crucially, police left open the possibility that Evelyn was still alive. She'd lost a lot of blood, but that didn't mean she died. At that point in the investigation, they still hoped to bring Evelyn home.
So in an attempt to figure out where the kidnapper took her, officers brought in tracker dogs. The hounds traced Evelyn's scent 2 blocks northeast of the Rasmussens' home, then abruptly lost it. To officers, this suggested that Evelyn's attacker had carried her 2 blocks up the road, then gotten into a car with her and fled.
This idea was corroborated by neighbors. One person had heard screaming around 7 p.m., and one had seen a suspicious car about an hour later. Unfortunately, neither person could offer more information.
Mr. and Mrs. Hartley didn't sleep at all that night. The next morning, October 25th, a massive search party ensued. Over 1,000 volunteers, including members of the U.S. Air Force, combed through every square inch of La Crosse. They couldn't find any trace of the girl or her attacker.
But the next day, a potential witness came forward. His name was Ed Hoffer. He said that shortly after 7 p.m. on the night of Evelyn's disappearance, he'd seen 2 large men speeding away from the Rasmussens' home in a car, with a young girl in the back seat.
Can you describe the vehicle?
Oh, sure. It was a green Buick. Probably a 41 or 42.
And what did the people inside look like?
There were 2 men. One was in the front seat driving. I couldn't really say much about him because I didn't think anything of it at the time. But in the back seat, now this stood out to me. It was another man. He had a girl next to him, and it almost looked like he was struggling to hold her up. She was slumped forward with her head against the front seats. I remember thinking she looked real tired, or maybe sick.
Do you have any idea where the car was headed?
I'm sorry, no. I just assumed they were all going to the homecoming game.
Hoffer's statement was huge. If he'd really seen Evelyn in the backseat of the car, then officers had 2 crucial pieces of information. First, there were 2 kidnappers. Second, they drove a green Buick. Maybe they'd be able to track Evelyn down after all.
So officers implemented a vehicle inspection program. They examined hundreds of cars in the La Crosse area, searching for bloodstains. Once a vehicle had been cleared, the driver was given a sticker that read, "My car is okay."
Soon enough, practically every automobile in La Crosse had this macabre message proudly displayed on its bumper. Police never found the green Buick Ed Hoffer mentioned, and they didn't identify any other suspicious vehicles either.
But a few days later, search parties uncovered some unsettling evidence. About 2 miles outside of La Crosse, near a highway intersection, they found a bloodstained bra. They couldn't know for sure if it was Evelyn's, but it certainly didn't bode well.
"4 miles further down the same road, searchers found a bloodied pair of men's pants. Southwest of La Crosse, they discovered 2 blood-stained sneakers. A few hundred feet away from the shoes was a well-worn men's denim jacket. It had dark red marks on the front, back, and sleeves.
The pants could have been a coincidence, but the shoes and jacket weren't.
The tread on the bottom of the shoes matches the prints you found at the crime scene. The blood also matches the puddles that were outside. It's Evelyn's type.
What about the jacket?
Same blood type. These are the kidnapper's clothes.
It's a lot of blood.
Yeah.
You think she could bleed that much and still be alive?
It's hard to say.
These 2 items of clothing, the shoes and the jacket, became detectives' primary pieces of evidence. Investigators believed the items would point towards the kidnappers, but they also suggested something less positive. Evelyn Hartley had lost even more blood than previously thought. If officers hoped to find her alive, they needed to hurry.
So they figured out what the clothing could tell them about the attackers. The sneakers were size 11, and from a brand called Goodrich. Authorities went to the manufacturers of the shoes and found that the specific design was sold in Wisconsin, Iowa, Michigan, Minnesota, and Illinois. That didn't exactly narrow down the possibilities.
However, a few other discoveries did. The shoes had a unique round pattern on the soles. Authorities guessed that this was caused by riding on a Whizzer brand motorbike. Other patterns of wear suggested that whoever wore the shoes frequently operated machinery, possibly in a factory or in construction.
And to make things even more interesting, the impressions on the soles of the shoes suggested they'd been worn by 2 different people. One of the wearer's feet were too big for the sneakers.
Perhaps two people were sharing the shoes. Or maybe Evelyn's kidnapper purposely wore sneakers that weren't his size. He might have anticipated leaving behind footprints and wore smaller shoes to conceal his identity.
As for the jacket, it was a size 36 and had marks running underneath both armpits. To detectives, it looked like wear from some kind of safety harness, further supporting the hypothesis that the kidnappers worked in a factory setting.
And according to investigators, it was very improbable that the shoes and the jacket were worn by the same person. Size 11 shoes were above average, while the size 36 jacket was relatively small. In all likelihood, the sneakers belonged to one kidnapper, the denim to another.
All things considered, it seemed like a pretty good start. La Crosse police knew they were looking for two men who probably worked in manual labor. One man was likely taller and larger than the other.
In addition to the ongoing search for clues, detectives embarked on a massive tour. They'd traveled the city, the county, and even the whole state. They'd question as many people as they had to. They'd bring Evelyn Hartley home.
Led by Sheriff Ivan Wright, authorities traveled to 31 different communities in and around La Crosse, Wisconsin. They showed the denim jacket to roughly 10,000 people.
Not a single person knew who it belonged to. Nobody admitted they knew, anyway.
The more time passed, the less likely it seemed that Evelyn would be found alive. Police were getting scared and desperate. They didn't know where else to look for answers.
In February of 1954, about 4 months after Evelyn's disappearance, Sheriff Ivan Wright died of a heart attack. Some people claimed it was brought on by the stress of the case, which was beginning to look unsolvable.
What are we supposed to do? We've got evidence, but none of it goes anywhere. We've got no sheriff, no leads, no Evelyn.
We just have to keep looking. We have to keep asking questions.
It doesn't matter how many questions we ask. There's someone around here who knows what happened to Evelyn, and they've got their lips sealed. Kidnappers aren't exactly the most truthful people.
Well, there is one option.
What?
You're not gonna like it.
Just say it, will you?
Lie detector tests.
Oh.
With no other options, La Crosse police resorted to using lie detector tests. Even in 1953, it was widely known that polygraphs were prone to mistakes and that they wouldn't hold up as evidence in court. Employing them was a last-ditch effort to find information.
Beginning in May of 1954, 6 months after Evelyn's disappearance, officers tested around 300 people. Nothing concrete came of this tedious work.
By the 1-year anniversary of Evelyn's kidnapping, La Crosse police had tested, interrogated, or questioned over 4,000 people. Throughout all this, a number of suspects arose and were systematically ruled out. Nobody was ever charged.
But 3 years later, in 1957, a new suspect came into consideration. This man checked 2 very important boxes.
Firstly, he was in La Crosse on the night of Evelyn's disappearance. In fact, he was from La Crosse, meaning he knew the town well enough to slip away from a crime scene using back roads.
And secondly, he was beyond violent. He'd been arrested after kidnapping, murdering, and mutilating a Wisconsin woman named Bernice Warden. When police investigated his home, they found a trove of horrors, including furniture and clothing made out of human body parts.
The man was serial killer Ed Gean, otherwise known as the Butcher of Plainfield.
Coming up, we'll examine whether Evelyn Hartley was the victim of one of America's most notorious murderers. And now, back to our story.
In October of 1953, 15-year-old babysitter Evelyn Hartley disappeared from La Crosse, Wisconsin. After 4 years of investigation, law enforcement had questioned thousands of people, discovered a few pieces of physical evidence, and identified numerous potential suspects, but ultimately none of these clues led anywhere. By 1957, Evelyn was still missing, and few people believed she'd ever be found.
Then in November of that same year, a possible suspect arose. His name was Edward Theodore Gean, and he was one of the most grisly killers the United States had ever seen.
Police in Plainfield, Wisconsin, a town about 100 miles east of La Crosse, arrested 51-year-old Ed Gean on suspicion of murder. He'd been implicated in the death of a hardware store owner named Bernice Warden. While a pair of officers questioned him, others searched his Plainfield farmhouse.
Ugh, looks like Mr. Gean's not much of a cleaner.
This furniture is weird. It's like homemade leather or something. Oh, geez, look at this lamp. The shade looks like a face.
How long did this guy live here? There's so many boxes, it's like he moved in and never unpacked. Oh God.
What is it?
It's a head. A whole head.
Inside Ed Gean's house, detectives found chairs covered in human skin, lampshades made out of people's faces, and boxes of body parts.
Somehow, that wasn't even the worst of it. They also found Bernice Warden's mutilated body inside of Gean's shed. Some of her organs were in his refrigerator, and her heart sat on his stove.
There was no question that Ed Gean was a killer. During their interrogation, police also surmised that he was a grave robber and possibly engaged in cannibalism and necrophilia.
To top it all off, officers discovered that Gean was in La Crosse on the night of Evelyn Hartley's disappearance. He'd been visiting family mere blocks from the Rasmussens' home. Suddenly, he became authorities' #1 suspect.
You were in La Crosse on October 24th, 1953?
Yes.
A teenage girl went missing that night. Evelyn Hartley. I got a feeling you might know something about her.
Oh, no. Teenagers, no.
There's a lot of skeletons in your closet, Ed. Literally.
I've never heard the name Evelyn.
You didn't read it in the papers? She's been all over the news for years now.
I don't read the papers.
We've got people searching your house, Ed. It's sick, the kind of stuff you've got in there. You can either tell us where Evelyn is now, or we'll keep digging until we find her.
You're not gonna find her.
Ed Gean was right. Authorities searched his entire home. Every square foot held some fresh horror, but Evelyn Hartley's remains were nowhere to be found.
Again, authorities resorted to using a lie detector test. Gean underwent 2 polygraphs regarding Evelyn's disappearance, and he passed both.
Police didn't have enough to charge him with the kidnapping. In fact, they couldn't even send him to jail. Ultimately, Ed Gean was found unfit to stand trial, ruled not guilty by reason of insanity, and sentenced to spend the rest of his life in a maximum security psychiatric facility.
Gean died from complications of cancer in 1984 at the age of 77. His entire life, he maintained that he had nothing to do with Evelyn Hartley's disappearance. Still, he was never entirely cleared, and many people consider him a viable suspect.
Unfortunately, Ed Gean's death meant the investigation into Evelyn's kidnapping had reached a standstill. It had been 31 years since the 15-year-old disappeared. Hope had been all but extinguished. Even Evelyn's mother and father had to accept that they would never see their daughter again.
Years continued to pass. Both of Evelyn's parents passed away. The detectives who worked on her case retired. Evelyn Hartley sank into the past. Until 2004.
In August of that year, a man named Mel Williams told police he might have caught one of the kidnappers' confessions on tape.
Williams said that sometime in the late 1960s and early 1970s, he'd owned a tavern in Lafarge, Wisconsin, a small town about 40 miles southeast of La Crosse. One night, a man named Clyde Peterson sat at the bar and ordered a beer.
Williams had served Peterson drinks many times before. He was a regular at the tavern, and Williams liked when he came by. He was always making people laugh.
That evening, Peterson was cracking jokes. Williams thought he was so funny that he started up his tape recorder. He asked Peterson questions and caught his hilarious answers on tape.
Then one of Peterson's friends, a local mink farmer, took a seat at the bar. All of a sudden, the conversation got a lot less funny.
Oh my word, Clyde, you're too much.
Hey, Clyde, tell them about that Hartley girl you kidnapped.
Oh, Whitey. Are you serious?
Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, Williams. You ever know a guy named Jack Gulfair?
I knew of him.
Oh, me and him kidnapped that girl. Remember the one who was all over the news?
Yeah, I remember.
Oh my God. We took her out to the farm and Jack killed her.
He what?
He killed her. He killed her.
Peterson's confession was chilling. But for some reason that still hasn't been adequately explained, Mel Williams waited approximately 35 years to bring the tape to police.
By that time, both Clyde Peterson and his alleged accomplice, Jack Gulfair, were dead. There was no chance of an arrest, but there might have been a possibility of closure.
On the tape, Peterson gave the approximate location of Evelyn Hartley's body. In 2004, an article published in the Journal-Gazette and Times-Courier said police were searching for Evelyn's remains and comparing samples of Peterson and Gulfair's DNA with blood found at the Rasmussen's home.
Sadly, no further information was ever publicized. Maybe the tape was a dead end, or perhaps just too much time had passed. It's possible that Williams purposely kept the recordings hidden until after Peterson and Gulfair died. That way the men could never be prosecuted or seek revenge against the person who spilled their violent secret.
But there might be one more clue inside the story. Jack Gulfair died by suicide 10 years after Evelyn Hartley's disappearance. Maybe he couldn't live with the guilt of what he'd done.
Although Evelyn Hartley's case is still technically open, most people, her surviving family included, don't believe she'll be found alive. Detectives almost always treat her case as a murder investigation. Still, La Crosse police keep her dental records on file. One day, they might be able to use these to identify her remains.
And, unsurprisingly, theories about Evelyn's apparent death abound. Some people still blame Ed Gean, while others think Mel Williams' tape is definitive evidence against Clyde Peterson and Jack Gulfair. There's also people who hypothesize that Evelyn was kidnapped by a drifter, or that she was killed after someone attempted to rob the Rasmussens' home.
It's difficult to find solid footing among all of these different theories. Still, I think Clyde Peterson and Jack Gulfair are the most likely culprits. Locals reported seeing two men near the Rasmussens' home, and Peterson openly admitted to the crime. It's possible that after the tape recording ended, he'd threatened Mel Williams into 35 years of silence.
I agree. The theory about Ed Gean seems convincing at first, but he wasn't known to target teenagers. It's still possible that he kidnapped Evelyn, but it would be outside of his usual M.O. Plus, none of Evelyn's remains were found in Gean's home. Police cleared him for a reason. In all likelihood, Peterson and Gulfair are responsible.
Evelyn's kidnapping was part of a larger social and cultural trend that saw adult men targeting teenage girls. As crimes of this kind became more and more common, they appeared in horror books and movies.
Soon enough, the victimized babysitter became a classic slasher film trope.
Most often, the monster broke into a home to terrorize his young victims. That's what happened to Janett Christman and Evelyn Hartley. But one real-life crime turned this trope on its head.
In April of 1981, a killer struck in rural Alberta, Canada. Instead of forcing his way into his victim's house, he lured her outside.
In 1979, director Fred Walton released his first full-length film, a horror movie titled When a Stranger Calls.
The story was based on an urban legend called The Babysitter and the Man Upstairs. In the film, a young babysitter is tormented by phone calls from a strange man. He repeatedly asks her,
Have you checked the children? Why haven't you checked the children?
Soon, viewers discovered that the man on the phone is a killer, and he's calling from inside the house.
This movie wasn't the first of its kind, and it certainly wasn't the last. There's an entire genre of horror films centered around babysitters. Sometimes they're the villains, most often they're the victims.
Beginning in the 1970s, telephones also increasingly appeared in scary movies. The trope was further cemented in our pop culture lexicon by films like Scream and Are You in the House Alone?, which depict teenage girls being hunted by murderers who call them and harass them.
In pop culture, the telephone became the weapon criminals used to target girls.
And in one small Canadian town, this fictional trope became a horrifying reality.
This is Unsolved Murders, True Crime Stories, a Spotify original from Parcast. I'm your host, Carter Roy.
And I'm your host, Wendy McKenzie. Every Tuesday, we dive into the world of a real unsolved murder and try to solve the case.
You can find episodes of Unsolved Murders and all other Spotify originals from Parcast for free on Spotify.
This is our final episode in a special 3-part series on babysitters. For the last few weeks, we've been diving into the history of babysitting in American culture. We're exploring how babysitters became the subjects of urban legends, slasher films, and real-life crimes.
Last week, we discussed the sexualization and mistreatment babysitters faced while on the job. We also investigated the disappearance of Evelyn Hartley, a 15-year-old girl who went missing from La Crosse, Wisconsin.
This week, we'll talk about how babysitters became horror movie tropes. Then we'll look into the 1981 murder of 15-year-old Kelly Cook, a girl who was lured from her home with a phone call. She got into a car with a man who called himself Bill Christensen, but that wasn't his real name.
We have all that and more coming up. Stay with us.
As early as 1950, Americans realized babysitting wasn't the simple, safe job they thought it was. Janett Christman was murdered in 1950. Evelyn Hartley disappeared in 1953. More and more often, sitters were meeting grisly ends.
So, in 1961, the Inglewood, California Police Department helped produce an educational film called Girls Beware. In the opening scene, a teenager gets a call from a man asking for a babysitter. She needs the extra money, so she agrees to watch his children that evening. He picks her up 15 minutes later.
By midnight, the girl still hasn't come home. Her mother gets worried. She calls the police, but law enforcement can't figure out where her daughter has gone.
A week later, they find her body on the side of an isolated road.
The messages were clear. Babysitting was dangerous. Strangers couldn't be trusted, and girls definitely shouldn't get in cars with people that they didn't know.
Girls Beware wasn't the only film that cast babysitting as a death sentence. Through the 1970s and 1980s, horror movies featuring sitters grew in popularity. The unconscious fear that many teenage girls faced became an on-screen cliché.
At the same time, crime rates increased. People in larger cities locked their houses and kept a close eye on their children. An atmosphere of fear fell over the country. Nobody wanted to become the victim of a slasher film monster.
But this terror hadn't quite made it into rural areas. In small towns, it was still common to leave doors open and let kids play without supervision. People in tight-knit communities trusted their neighbors.
One such community was called Standard. It was a tiny farming town in rural Alberta, Canada. Standard had a population of just 400 people, one of whom was 15-year-old Kelly Cook.
On April 22, 1981, Kelly Cook rolled out of bed, still groggy. It was Wednesday, so she showered, brushed her hair, and got dressed for school.
She went down to have breakfast. While she ate, she flipped open a textbook. She was only a sophomore in high school, but she had big aspirations. Kelly Cook wanted to become a lawyer. That meant she had to focus. She studied even as she swallowed bites of toast.
When she finished her food, she tossed her plate in the sink. Just before she walked out the front door, the phone rang.
Hello?
Is this Kelly Cook?
Yes, who's this?
My name's Bill Christensen. I'm new to the area, but my wife and I need a babysitter tonight. I've been asking around, and it sounds like a lot of parents trust you.
Oh, that's very nice to hear.
Can I pick you up around 8:30 tonight?
I'll have to ask my mom.
Well, if you aren't free, I'll need to call someone else.
Oh, right. Well, I should be able to. I'll let you know if anything changes.
Kelly asked her mother Marion if she could babysit for Bill Christensen that night. Marion had never heard of the man before, but Christensen was a very common last name in their small town. She told Kelly to ask around at school and see if anyone knew a Bill Christensen.
That day, Kelly talked to her classmates about Bill Christensen. Nobody could put a finger on exactly who he was, but they all assumed he must be someone's cousin or uncle.
When Kelly got home that afternoon, she told her mom that Bill was probably related to someone in town. Marion was hesitant. Still, Kelly insisted everything would be fine.
Eventually, Marion acquiesced. Kelly, her two younger siblings, her mother, and her father all ate dinner together that evening. Then, at 8:30 p.m., the man who called himself Bill Christensen pulled up outside.
He drove a light-colored car with Alberta plates. He didn't get out of the vehicle to introduce himself. He just sat in the driveway and waited for Kelly to come to him.
Dad, Bill's outside.
He's not gonna come up to the door?
I guess not.
All right, call us when you get there. And remind me when you're gonna be home?
I'll be back by midnight.
Kelly walked out the front door. She and Bill drove away.
Within half an hour, Marion and her husband Walter were concerned. Kelly hadn't called to let them know she'd arrived at Bill's house, and it was very unlike her to forget to check in.
So Marion started calling around town. She asked her friends if they'd heard of Bill Christensen. Everyone knew the surname, but nobody was sure who Bill was.
Marion called people who worked at the bank, the convenience store, and the post office. She figured they would be the first to know if someone new had moved to town. But no one had heard of Bill, and they didn't know of any new Christensens in the area either.
Marion sat next to the phone, biting her nails. Walter tried to put her at ease.
She probably just forgot to call. She's had a lot on her mind lately, studying all the time. I'm sure she'll be back before midnight.
But she wasn't. When the clock struck 12, Kelly's parents really started to worry. They didn't want to jump to any conclusions, but something was clearly wrong.
Marion called the police and told them she feared her daughter had been abducted.
The Royal Canadian Mounted Police, or RCMP, arrived without missing a beat. By 12:30 a.m., Constable Jim Bezant was patrolling the streets of Standard, searching for Kelly. Her father sat in the passenger seat with his eyes peeled.
You said the man's name was Bill Christensen?
Yes.
Huh. Never heard of him. You got any idea where he lives?
No.
You didn't ask your daughter where she was going to babysit.
I didn't think...
Did you see this guy? Get a good look at his face or anything?
Well, he didn't come to the door.
Did you at least write down his license plate number?
No, I figured everything would be fine.
The constable soon realized just how little information Kelly's parents had. Being from a small town, they trusted their neighbors. They didn't think anything bad could happen in Standard, so they let their daughter drive away with a man they knew practically nothing about.
Walter's lack of knowledge was a terrible omen. He rode with the police all night, but despite their best efforts, law enforcement couldn't find any trace of Kelly or her abductor.
The search continued into the next morning. Word of Kelly's disappearance spread through Standard, and a group of at least 600 volunteers scoured the town. People made their way through vast fields, looking for any sign of the missing girl. Helicopters got an aerial view, while 40 RCMP officers patrolled the streets.
At first, locals and law enforcement were bright-eyed and determined. Beginning on April 23, 1981, every car that drove into or out of Standard was frisked and every driver was questioned. But as the days passed, officers' optimism faded. The work was tedious, exhausting, and ultimately failed to reveal any important information.
Marion and Walter Cook couldn't believe it. Kelly had simply vanished. Whoever Bill Christensen was, he'd managed to disappear. The only clue he left was his name.
Searching through records from across Canada, law enforcement found at least 35 Bill Christensens in the country. It wasn't foolproof, but it was a good place to start.
Plus, the RCMP had already been contacted by a potential witness, a telephone operator who believed she'd spoken to Kelly on the night she disappeared.
Coming up, officers learn more about the man who called himself Bill Christensen.
On April 22, 1981, 15-year-old Kelly Cook took a babysitting job with a man who said his name was Bill Christensen. She was supposed to be home by midnight, but days later she was nowhere to be found. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police followed up on a number of leads.
They investigated every Bill Christensen in Canada. All 35 of these men were cleared, which could only mean one thing. The man who picked Kelly up used a pseudonym.
This wasn't entirely surprising. After all, police were treating Kelly's disappearance as an abduction. It made sense that the kidnapper would want to obscure his identity.
But the realization also revealed another, more interesting truth.
What'd you think when you heard the name Christensen?
I just thought, well, that's a real common name.
Because everyone in the area knows a Christensen, right?
Exactly.
So this man, this Bill, he must have known enough about Standard to realize how many Christensens there are here. He must have been familiar. You understand?
I'm not sure.
What I'm saying, Mr. Cook, is that this person, well, he might have been from Standard. He might have been your neighbor or your friend. Anybody, really.
Surely not.
I can't say for certain, but right now, everyone's a suspect.
The RCMP wasn't giving anybody the benefit of the doubt. Plus, tips were pouring in. The abduction shook the tiny town, and practically everyone in Standard had some idea of who Bill Christensen might be.
But one tip stuck out. A telephone operator told police she believed she'd picked up a call from Kelly on the night of her abduction.
The call came in around 10:30 that night from a payphone in Hazar. I picked up and I just heard screaming, really loud screaming. All I could tell was that it was a girl's voice. I tried to ask her what was going on, but the call cut off too fast.
There was no way to prove that the call had come from Kelly, but both law enforcement and the Cook family believed it did. If they were right, it revealed two clues. The man who called himself Bill had driven through Hazar, a small town about 15 miles southeast of Standard, and at some point, Kelly had tried to escape and call for help.
It seemed like a potential breakthrough, but the information didn't actually do much to help police. Even if Bill drove through Hazar, he could have gone anywhere from there. Furthermore, he'd been sneaking through the town past sundown. As far as records suggest, nobody in Hazar saw a suspicious man or vehicle, probably because it was too late or too dark outside.
Ultimately, the lead did little more than frighten Kelly's parents. If their daughter had been screaming, then she knew she was in danger. They held on to hope that Kelly was still alive and that she'd try to call again. They left their porch light on every night, a beacon to help Kelly find her way home.
Police officers and Kelly's parents waited by their phones, hoping to hear from someone who could offer more information. maybe even Kelly herself.
The 15-year-old never called, but soon enough, law enforcement received another important tip. A gas station owner who remained anonymous said that on the day of Kelly's abduction, a strange man came into his store and asked to use his phone.
The phone's right there, behind the checkout counter. I was standing up here, helping some customers, and I overheard some bits and pieces of his conversation. I just know I heard him talking about babysitting.
Can you remember what he looked like?
Oh, sure. He was probably about 5'8" or 5'9", in his late 30s or 40s. Pretty average size, maybe around 200 pounds.
Anything stick out about him?
I remember he had dark brown hair. It might have been curly. He was clean shaven. I know that for sure.
Okay. What about identifying features? If someone passed this guy on the street, what would they notice?
Well, his face was really tanned and wrinkled, like a truck driver or a construction worker or something. Someone who spent a whole lot of time in the sun. Other than that, he was pretty average.
Using the gas station owner's description, the RCMP created a composite sketch of the suspect. The pencil drawing showed a middle-aged man with a round face, dark hair parted to one side, and large, square sunglasses.
Apparently, officers believe this person was Bill Christensen because they released the sketch and the physical description to the public. They asked for tips from anyone who'd seen the man in the drawing.
And sure enough, tips came. The RCMP already had plenty of leads, but now there were too many to handle. According to one officer, police had at least 500 tips to investigate at any given time. This influx of information didn't let up for 2 years.
Every lead, no matter how small, had to be followed up on. Even though everyone who called the police meant well, tips that led nowhere ultimately distracted from the investigation and wasted time. The RCMP was stretched too thin to make any real headway.
And as detectives scrambled to make sense of all the different leads, Marion and Walter Cook grew more desperate. They appeared on television where they begged the man that abducted their daughter to bring her back home, and where they promised Kelly that they would never stop trying to find her.
Publicly, the Cooks stayed remarkably composed. Privately, however, they couldn't help but feel suspicious of everyone around them. As hard as they tried to remain optimistic, their minds wandered into very frightening territory. They agonized over whether or not their daughter was still alive, and they racked their brains for some reason why she was targeted.
But as it turned out, Bill Christensen didn't exactly target Kelly. At first, he had his eye on someone else.
A local high schooler, we'll call her Annie, spoke to the police. Through tears, she said,
4 days before, on April 18th. I'm sorry. I got a call from Bill, or the man who says his name is Bill. He asked me to babysit for him. I told him I was busy, but I knew someone who might be able to help him. I gave him Kelly's name.
Annie's story turned the investigation upside down. There were a couple of different possibilities. Perhaps Bill Christensen had been targeting Annie and only called Kelly at her suggestion. Or maybe Bill was simply looking for any teenage girl.
It was also possible that Bill never intended to kidnap Kelly or Annie. Maybe something else had happened. Perhaps he and Kelly had been in a car accident or gotten lost on the rural roads.
But that didn't seem very likely. Rather, RCMP officers believed Bill had been meticulous. He'd chosen a pseudonym that wouldn't raise any red flags, and he didn't call Kelly or Annie, in all likelihood, from his own phone. He took clear steps to hide his identity and get a teenage girl alone.
In other words, police now believed they were investigating a premeditated crime. That meant Bill Christensen was probably more dangerous than they'd previously thought. They had to find Kelly before it was too late.
But sadly, time was already up. On June 28, 1981, About 2 months after Kelly was abducted, a young man named Jerry Nelson was driving his motorcycle on the outskirts of Alberta. It was a perfect summer day, so he and 4 of his friends had set out for a ride around Chin Lake. The large irrigation reservoir was man-made, but it was just as pretty as a natural pond.
Jerry was a few hundred yards ahead of his friends, staring across the still waters, when he noticed something odd near the shore. He drove closer to it, then stopped dead on his tracks.
It was a girl's body, face down on the sand. Even from a distance, Jerry could see that she'd been bound with ropes. Someone had tied 2 cement cinder blocks to the corpse, presumably to make it sink. Of course, that hadn't worked. Even with the added weight, the body had washed onto the sand.
Jerry felt sick. This was no accidental drowning. This was a murder.
Jerry and his friends flagged down a nearby boat and asked the sailors to call the police. Within minutes, officers arrived on the scene. Less than 24 hours later, dental records confirmed the body belonged to 15-year-old Kelly Cook.
On one hand, the discovery of Kelly's body was obviously terrible news. Her family was crushed. For the first time in months, they left their porch light off all night. There was no reason to waste electricity. Kelly was never coming home.
On the other hand, Kelly's remains did provide an opportunity. Up until that point, RCMP officers had practically no physical evidence with which to track down Bill Christensen. They immediately brought the body in for an autopsy, hoping to find clues that would lead them to Kelly's killer.
Coming up, the RCMP searches for a murderer and ends up getting help from the FBI. Now, back to the story.
On June 28, 1981, a young man stumbled on 15-year-old Kelly Cook's remains. Her body had washed up on the shore of Chin Lake, a reservoir about 2.5 hours south of Standard, Alberta. She'd been bound with ropes and weighed down with 2 cement cinder blocks.
The Royal Canadian Mounted Police, or RCMP, sent Kelly's body to a medical examiner. An autopsy revealed a key clue.
Kelly hadn't died of drowning. Rather, she'd been asphyxiated, and she was already dead when her killer dumped her body in Chin Lake.
But other crucial details were still unclear. Detectives had no way of knowing if Bill planned to hide Kelly's body in Chin Lake or if he chose the location at the last minute. They also didn't know the exact circumstances of Kelly's death. Bill might have murdered her the night he picked her up, or he might have held her captive for weeks.
Either way, one thing was now clear. There was a killer on the loose, and it was up to the RCMP to catch him.
Detectives continued poring over leads. Meanwhile, Kelly's family organized her funeral. On July 3rd, the local church overflowed with mourners. Businesses shut down. Kelly's entire high school class showed up at the service. Her family realized that they weren't the only ones experiencing a terrible loss. The whole town of Standard had been affected by the crime.
And yet, a certain fear lingered, even amongst friends, family, and neighbors. Kelly's family felt suspicious. Anyone could be Bill Christensen.
Law enforcement agreed. In fact, a report from the funeral home seemed to suggest that Kelly's killer had tried to get close to her casket.
When did this happen again?
Yesterday, officer. I just finished preparing the body, and this man walked into the funeral parlor. He was around 6 feet tall, maybe in his late 30s. He asked if he could see Kelly's body.
What did you say?
I said no, not unless he had permission from the family. It was just awfully strange, because as far as I know, the only people who knew Kelly's body would be held here overnight were her parents. I asked them, and they said they didn't know of any friends or relatives that tried to visit the parlor. It just really rubbed me the wrong way.
Have you seen the man again since then? Any chance he was at the funeral today?
I don't think I saw him, but honestly, I wasn't really looking. He definitely could have been there.
There's no way to know if the man that asked to see Kelly's body was the same man who called himself Bill Christensen. The physical descriptions seemed to overlap. Both men were middle-aged and of fairly average height, but both descriptions were also pretty vague. Nevertheless, in April of 1982, almost a year after Kelly's abduction, detectives were still searching for the person who asked to see the 15-year-old's body.
That's probably because it was one of the best leads law enforcement had. Tips still came in regularly, but the RCMP had cleared every potential suspect. No accusations stuck.
Desperate, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police sought help from an unlikely source, the USA's Federal Bureau of Investigation.
Kelly Cook's murder was one of the first Canadian cases to be taken to the FBI's Behavioral Sciences Unit. American analysts created a profile of Kelly's killer. According to them, Bill Christensen was likely unmarried, but had a string of bitter breakups in his past. They said he'd probably been guilty of intimate partner violence and might have been arrested on domestic abuse charges in the past.
RCMP lead investigator Earl Peters said he found the FBI's analysis interesting, but imperfect. Ultimately, he believed the criminal profile was just an educated guess, which meant it couldn't take law enforcement very far.
And neither could anything else. As months passed, tips dried up. The police had countless questions and close to zero answers. They spent hours upon hours theorizing.
I might head home for the day. We're not getting anywhere.
No, wait. You were saying about that case in British Columbia? I think you might be onto something.
It's all speculation.
No, Jim, it's a theory. What's the guy's name again?
Clifford Robert Olson, charged with 11 murders in and around Vancouver, most of them targeting teenage girls. Seems like a likely culprit until you remember that Vancouver is more than 600 miles away.
He could have come to Standard, Jim. You know that.
I don't have any proof.
Okay, so let's think closer. Vancouver's too far, but what about Calgary? A big city, less than 60 miles down the road.
I've gone through all the cold cases in Calgary. It's possible that there's a connection. There are a few cases of young women who were strangled with some kind of cord. Kelly died of asphyxiation, but we don't know if the killer used a weapon or his hands. There's no way to know if the MO lines up. Plus, those cases are unsolved. We don't even have the killer's name.
All right. Where else can we look?
I don't know. I think we're running out of options. I'm gonna head out. Try to get some rest tonight, okay? Maybe tomorrow's the day we get our big break.
Unfortunately for the RCMP, the next day proved just as uneventful as the last. They followed up on various Canadian cold cases and searched for connections to Kelly's murder, but nothing concrete materialized. Weeks passed, then months, then years.
By 1990, 9 years after Kelly's death, the RCMP had interviewed approximately 2,002. Over the following decades, they continued receiving sporadic tips, all of which they investigated thoroughly.
As of 2021, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police still hope to solve Kelly's murder. It's certainly possible for her killer to be arrested and brought to trial. If the descriptions law enforcement received were accurate, Bill Christensen would likely be between 70 and 85 years old today.
According to RCMP investigator Earl Peters, detectives currently have about 40 persons of interest. Because the agency hopes to eventually make an arrest, they've kept information about potential suspects under wraps.
Even so, the RCMP still welcomes tips from people who have concrete clues about Kelly Cook and Bill Christensen. They believe it's likely that Bill confessed his crime to at least one person, perhaps a close friend or a lover. According to law enforcement, someone somewhere has to know what happened to Kelly Cook.
And there's a good reason for them to come forward. There's a $130,000 reward waiting for whoever provides information leading to Bill Christensen's arrest and conviction.
Hopefully, someone's conscience and the promise of a small fortune will bring the truth to light.
With no clear leads, it's difficult to guess who Bill Christensen might be. Based on the available evidence, I think he was a person who had friends or relatives in Standard. He must have known the community well enough to choose a fitting pseudonym, but not so well that locals would recognize him.
I agree. I also think he probably didn't target Kelly specifically. He was just looking for a victim. Any girl in Standard could have met the same horrifying fate. More than anything, Bill Christensen used the small town's trusting nature as a weapon. He didn't just take Kelly's life, he took a sense of safety away from everyone in Standard.
The same can be said for the men who killed Janett Christman and Evelyn Hartley. These teenagers simultaneously illustrate how girls so often become the victims of masculine brutality, as well as how the archetypal babysitter horror stories evolved over the years.
All three of these cases were cruel and senseless. They each appear to be acts of random violence in which girls were simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. Without a definitive answer in any of their murders, these teenagers' loved ones are left with no sense of closure or justice. Just confusion, suspicion, and lingering fear.
Ultimately, Janett, Evelyn, and Kelly all had their lives stolen from them. Hopefully, one day, we'll know who to blame.